The courtroom was buzzing with whispers. The air was thick with tension as a black woman sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across the room, a group of police officers chuckled under their breath, exchanging amused glances. They had seen it all before: another case, another person trying to talk their way out of trouble. To them, this was just another routine trial, another day where the system worked the way it always had. But the woman sitting there wasn't nervous. She didn't fidget. She didn't plead or beg. Instead, she sat with an unsettling calm, her eyes scanning the room as if she was waiting for the perfect moment. The judge asked her to speak, and as she rose to her feet, the room fell silent. Then, in a steady, unwavering voice, she said something that sent a jolt through the entire courtroom. "I am a federal judge." The officers' smirks disappeared in an instant. The color drained from their faces. A hush fell over the crowd as reality settled in. The very woman they had laughed at, the one they thought was just another defendant, was actually someone with more authority than anyone in that room. The shift in energy was undeniable. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a lesson in karma they would never forget. While that shocking moment played out in one part of the country, in another city, a very different yet equally powerful story was unfolding. On a crowded city bus, a young black teenager sat near the window, his headphones in, eyes half closed as the world moved around him. It was just another ride home after school, nothing special. That was, until he noticed her, a pregnant woman, standing near the front, gripping the overhead rail, her face tired and weary. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his earbuds, stood up, and gestured for her to take a seat. "Ma'am, you can sit here," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes locking onto his. Then, with a grateful nod, she lowered herself into the seat, exhaling a deep sigh of relief. The bus rattled forward, passengers coming and going, but as they approached her stop, she turned back to the boy and slipped something into his hand. A small, folded note. "Read this when you get home," she whispered before stepping off the bus. He looked down at the note, puzzled, before tucking it into his pocket. He had no idea that inside those few lines was something that would change his life forever. But what did the note say? And how would one simple act of kindness lead to something he never could have imagined? Stay tuned to find out. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers. The air was thick with tension as a black woman sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across the room, a group of police officers chuckled under their breath, exchanging amused glances. They had seen it all before: another case, another person trying to talk their way out of trouble. To them, this was just another routine trial, another day where the system worked the way it always had. But the woman sitting there wasn't nervous. She didn't fidget. She didn't plead or beg. Instead, she sat with an unsettling calm, her eyes scanning the room as if she was waiting for the perfect moment. The judge asked her to speak, and as she rose to her feet, the room fell silent. Then, in a steady, unwavering voice, she said something that sent a jolt through the entire courtroom. "I am a federal judge." The officers' smirks disappeared in an instant. The color drained from their faces. A hush fell over the crowd as reality settled in. The very woman they had laughed at, the one they thought was just another defendant, was actually someone with more authority than anyone in that room. The shift in energy was undeniable. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a lesson in karma they would never forget. While that shocking moment played out in one part of the country, in another city, a very different yet equally powerful story was unfolding. On a crowded city bus, a young black teenager sat near the window, his headphones in, eyes half closed as the world moved around him. It was just another ride home after school, nothing special. That was, until he noticed her, a pregnant woman, standing near the front, gripping the overhead rail, her face tired and weary. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his earbuds, stood up, and gestured for her to take a seat. "Ma'am, you can sit here," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes locking onto his. Then, with a grateful nod, she lowered herself into the seat, exhaling a deep sigh of relief. The bus rattled forward, passengers coming and going, but as they approached her stop, she turned back to the boy and slipped something into his hand. A small, folded note. "Read this when you get home," she whispered before stepping off the bus. He looked down at the note, puzzled, before tucking it into his pocket. He had no idea that inside those few lines was something that would change his life forever. But what did the note say? And how would one simple act of kindness lead to something he never could have imagined? The teenager sat back down, the weight of the small note pressing against his palm. His mind raced with curiosity, but he resisted the urge to open it right there on the bus. Instead, he stuffed it into his pocket, telling himself he'd read it later. The rest of the ride felt different now, like something had shifted in the air around him. He glanced at the empty seat where the woman had been, wondering why she had been so secretive about the note. When he finally got home, he dropped his backpack by the door and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. His heart pounded a little harder than usual as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but hurried, like someone had written it in a rush. "You remind me of someone very special. Please call this number. It could change your life." There was no name, just a phone number at the bottom. He stared at the note, his mind running in circles. Who was this woman? What did she mean by change your life? Was this some kind of joke? A mistake? His fingers hovered over his phone, debating whether to dial the number. A part of him felt nervous. What if this was a scam? Or worse, what if it was something serious? But then again, there was something about the woman's eyes when she handed him the note, something that told him this wasn't random. She meant for him to have it. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the air remained thick with tension. The officers who had been laughing moments before now looked stiff, their hands resting uneasily on their belts. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, realizing the weight of their mistake. The woman who had just revealed herself as a federal judge stood tall, her presence commanding the room. She took a slow step forward, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking onto each officer who had chuckled at her expense. Their expressions were no longer smug. Now, they were laced with embarrassment and unease. "For years, I have sat in courtrooms like this one," she began, her voice steady and full of authority. "I have watched people underestimated, dismissed, and mistreated because of how they look, where they come from, or because someone assumed they weren't worthy of respect." A few of the officers shifted in their seats. Others looked down, avoiding her eyes. "But today," she continued, "I am here not as a judge, but as a reminder. A reminder that you never truly know who someone is. And more importantly, you never know the weight of your actions until it is too late." The silence in the room was deafening. No one dared to speak. The judge turned toward the actual judge sitting on the bench, who had been watching the entire exchange with interest. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I request that this case be dismissed immediately." The judge nodded slightly, clearly understanding the gravity of the moment. But before anything could be finalized, one of the officers, one who had laughed the loudest, cleared his throat. His face was pale, his confidence shaken, but he forced himself to speak. "With all due respect," he said hesitantly, "if you're a federal judge, why were you even arrested?" A small, almost amused smile flickered across her face. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that the words sent a chill down the room. "Because sometimes," she said, "power doesn't protect you from prejudice." The officers swallowed hard. No one had an answer for that. Back in the teenager's small apartment, he paced back and forth, his phone in hand. He had dialed the number, but his thumb hovered over the call button, frozen in hesitation. Was he really about to call a stranger? What if he was getting himself into something he couldn't handle? But the words on the note stuck in his head. It could change your life. Finally, with a deep breath, he pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice answered. "Hello." It was the woman from the bus. He hesitated. Hi. You gave me a note today. On the bus." There was a pause. Then, her voice softened. "I was hoping you'd call." Yeah, he shifted on his feet, unsure of what to say next. "What did you mean by all that? About changing my life?" The woman sighed, and for a moment, he thought the call had disconnected. But then she spoke again, her words careful, deliberate. "I don't know if you believe in fate, but I do," she said. "And today, when I saw you give up your seat, I knew I had to tell you." "Tell me what?" Another pause. Then, her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "That I knew your father." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat. What, he managed to say. That's not possible. My father died before I was born. The woman was quiet for a long time. I know, she said finally, but there's something you don't know. Something he left behind for you. The teenager's mind spun. His father had been gone his whole life. There was nothing he had ever left behind for him. No letters, no photos, nothing. At least, that's what he had always been told. What are you talking about? He asked, gripping the phone tighter. Who are you? You'll find out soon, she said. Meet me tomorrow. I'll explain everything. His pulse pounded in his ears. This was crazy. Completely insane. And yet, a deep part of him knew. He had to find out the truth. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the officers sat stiffly as the federal judge gathered her things. They had come in feeling untouchable, laughing at a woman they assumed was beneath them. Now, they were leaving with their heads down, their pride shattered. Karma had spoken, and they had no choice but to listen. But for the teenager on the other side of town, his story was just beginning. And tomorrow, he would come face to face with a truth that could change everything he thought he knew about his life. And the woman on the phone? She wasn't just a stranger. She was the key to a past he never knew existed. What secrets did she hold? And how would they shape his future? The answers were closer than he thought. The teenager barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind played the conversation over and over. I knew your father. Those words had cracked something inside him, something he had never let himself question before. He had spent his whole life accepting that his father was just gone. A name, a shadow, nothing more. And now, a complete stranger was telling him there was more to the story. By the time morning came, his nerves were a tangled mess. He thought about backing out, about pretending the note never existed, but deep down he knew he couldn't do that. If there was even the slightest chance that this woman was telling the truth, he had to hear her out. The meeting spot was a small cafe on the edge of downtown, tucked away between two old brick buildings. He arrived early, his foot tapping anxiously under the table. The minutes stretched on endlessly until, finally, she walked in. She looked different in the daylight, older than he had realized, with tired eyes that carried a weight he couldn't quite place. But when she saw him, she smiled, a warm but knowing smile, like she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Thank you for coming, she said as she sat across from him. I almost didn't, he admitted. I don't even know why I'm here. The woman nodded as if she understood completely. Because you need to know the truth. He swallowed hard. The truth about what? She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. About your father. About who he really was. The teenager felt his stomach tighten. I know who he was. My mom told me everything. He died before I was born. End of story. The woman sighed. That's what she told you. But that's not the full truth. He shook his head. No, that doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't she tell me? Her eyes darkened. Because she was protecting you. He felt the floor shift beneath him, like everything he had ever believed was suddenly on shaky ground. Protecting me from what? The woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Your father. He wasn't just some ordinary man. He was involved in something bigger, something dangerous. And when he died, he left behind something people have been searching for ever since. His pulse quickened. What are you talking about? What did he leave behind? She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn-out envelope. This. He stared at it, his throat dry. What is it? A letter, she said. From your father. He wrote it before he died. His fingers twitched, itching to grab it, but at the same time, he was terrified of what was inside. This was too much. Too sudden. He had spent his entire life without a single trace of his father, and now, in the span of 24 hours, he was being handed a letter from the man himself. Why do you have this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman sighed. Because your father trusted me. And because I promised him I'd give this to you when the time was right. He finally reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he took the envelope. The paper was old, the edges slightly frayed. His name was written on the front in faded ink. He took a deep breath, then carefully tore it open. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears. Son, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. And it means you're in danger. His breath caught. What is this? He stammered. The woman's face was serious. The reason I gave you that note on the bus wasn't just because you reminded me of someone. It was because I knew you were ready to hear the truth. And now that you've opened that letter, there's no going back. He felt like the world was spinning too fast. His father's words were right there, warning him of a danger he never knew existed. What danger? He asked, gripping the letter. What was he afraid of? The woman glanced around the cafe, as if making sure no one was listening. Then she lowered her voice. The same people who were after him, she said. They might come for you next. Meanwhile, across town, the officers from the courtroom sat in a dimly lit office, their faces grim. The laughter from the day before was long gone, replaced by a nervous tension none of them dared to speak about. What do we do now? One of them asked. We messed up big time. Another officer clenched his jaw. We didn't just mess up. We humiliated a federal judge in open court. Do you have any idea what that means for us? Silence hung over the room like a thick fog. They had thought it was just another routine day, another case to handle and move on from. But now, they were at the center of something much bigger than they had anticipated. She's not going to let this go, one of them muttered. She doesn't have to, another officer said darkly. We just have to make sure we clean this up before it gets worse. A chilling pause filled the air. And just like that, two different stories, one in a courtroom and one in a quiet cafe, were beginning to collide in ways no one could predict. For the teenager holding his father's letter, the truth was finally within reach. But he had no idea just how dangerous the truth could be. The teenager's hands trembled as he gripped the letter, his father's words burning into his mind. If you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. And it means you're in danger. His pulse pounded in his ears. The cafe around him suddenly felt too small, too open. He glanced at the woman sitting across from him, her expression unreadable. What does this mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman sighed, leaning forward. Your father was involved in something bigger than you know. He tried to protect your family, but there were people, dangerous people, who wanted something from him. And if they find out you have this letter, they won't stop coming. The teenager swallowed hard. Why now? Why give this to me now? She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Because I think they're already watching. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He looked around, his eyes darting from face to face in the cafe. Was someone here? Was someone listening? I need to know everything, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. No more secrets. She nodded. Your father was working on something before he died. Something that could have exposed a lot of powerful people. But before he could finish, he was taken out. His breath hitched. Taken out? You mean? Yes, she said grimly. It wasn't an accident. And now, the people responsible may be looking for you, thinking he left behind something important. His grip on the letter tightened. His whole life, he had believed his father's death was just a tragedy, something unfortunate that had happened before he was even born. But now, he was being told it was something much darker, something deliberate. What were they after? He asked, his voice hoarse. The woman hesitated. Something he hid. And I think you might be the key to finding it. The words sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over him. He had spent his life just trying to get by, never thinking he had any connection to something bigger. But now, he was being told that his father's past was reaching out from the grave, pulling him into a storm he didn't understand. Meanwhile, across town, the officers who had humiliated the federal judge were realizing just how deep their mistake ran. One of them sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He replayed the moment in court, the moment the woman had stood up and revealed who she really was. They had laughed at her, mocked her. And now the consequences were coming fast. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. He hesitated before picking it up. She knows too much, a voice on the other end said. And if we don't act fast, this will get out of control. He swallowed hard. What do you want me to do? Fix it, the voice said. Before it's too late. The call ended. The officer sat in silence, his mind racing. He had thought this was just another case, another person to push through the system. But now, He was in deeper than he had ever intended. Back at the cafe, the teenager felt like the walls were closing in. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted. I don't even know who to trust. The woman gave him a long, steady look. You can trust me, she said. But you have to decide now. Once we go down this road, there's no turning back. His heartbeat pounded in his chest. He thought about his mother, about the life he had always known. Could he really walk away from everything just to chase a truth that might destroy him? Then, he looked down at the letter again. His father had written it for him. He had risked everything to get this message to him. And if he walked away now, he might never know why. He took a deep breath. What do we do next? The woman's eyes darkened. We run. The teenager barely had time to process her words before she stood up and grabbed his arm. Now, she hissed. That was when he saw them. 2 men in dark suits, standing by the entrance. Their eyes locked onto him. His stomach dropped. They had been found. Panic surged through him, but the woman was already moving. She pulled him toward the back exit, pushing through the crowded cafe as the men followed. The teenager's heart pounded as they burst out into the alley. Keep moving, she urged, dragging him down the narrow street. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder. They weren't going to make it. And just like that, his whole world turned upside down. The teenager's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he sprinted down the alley, his pulse hammering in his ears. The woman's grip on his wrist was tight, unrelenting, pulling him forward even when his legs screamed for rest. The sound of footsteps behind them was closing in. The men in suits weren't just following, they were hunting them. They turned a sharp corner, nearly knocking over a trash can. The teenager's mind raced.
Who were these men?
How had they found him so fast? Over here, the woman whispered urgently, yanking him toward a metal door wedged between 2 abandoned buildings. She shoved it open, and they stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was their ragged breathing. The teenager pressed himself against the cold wall, trying to stay quiet. He could hear footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Then, silence. The woman held up a finger, signaling for him to stay still. He clenched his fists, barely breathing. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. The woman exhaled, leaning against the door. That was too close. The teenager swallowed hard. Who are they? How did they know where to find us? The woman hesitated. Because they've been watching you. Probably for longer than you think. His stomach twisted. The idea that someone had been following him, tracking his movements, made his skin crawl.
Why?
What do they want? She looked at him carefully. They think you know something. Or that you have something they need. The teenager's mind flashed back to the letter in his pocket, his father's warning. You're in danger. It was starting to make sense now. Terrifying, awful sense. Then something else hit him. You said we needed to run, he whispered. But you knew they were coming, didn't you? You knew we'd be followed. The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. He felt his stomach drop. You led me here on purpose, he realized. Didn't you? She sighed, rubbing her temples. It's not what you think. Then what is it? He demanded, his voice rising. Why should I trust you? She turned to him, her eyes sharp. Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have let them take you. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down he knew she was right. She had pulled him out of that cafe, put herself in danger for him. But that didn't mean she was telling him everything. The teenager took a step back, trying to steady his thoughts. You're still keeping secrets, he accused. She let out a slow breath. There are things I can't tell you yet. But I swear, everything I've done has been to protect you. He wanted to believe her. But before he could respond, the door rattled. His heart lurched. Someone was outside. The woman grabbed his arm. We have to move. Now. They slipped out a side door into another narrow alley. The city stretched out in front of them, cars, people, lights, normal life, just a few blocks away. But to the teenager, it felt like a different world. Where are we going? He asked as they hurried down the street.
To someone who can help, she said.
They weaved through the crowd, their pace quick, but not suspicious. The teenager kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the men in suits at any second. But they never appeared. After a few blocks, the woman slowed, turning toward a small bookstore with faded lettering on the window. She pushed open the door, and a bell chimed softly. Inside, the place smelled like old paper and dust. Books lined every wall, stacked high in uneven piles. Behind the counter, an older man with silver hair looked up from a newspaper. His eyes narrowed when he saw them. "You brought him here?" he asked the woman, his voice low. "He needs answers," she said. The man studied the teenager for a long moment before nodding. "Lock the door," he said. The teenager's pulse pounded as the woman turned the bolt. He had no idea where he was or who this man was, but something told him that whatever happened next was going to change everything. The teenager stood frozen just inside the bookstore, his pulse hammering in his ears. The old man watched him carefully, as if measuring his every breath, every movement. The woman who had led him here stayed silent, her expression unreadable. The weight of everything, the letter, the chase, the men in suits, pressed down on him like a heavy fog. The old man finally spoke. "You have the letter, don't you?" The teenager hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out the worn piece of paper. The old man's eyes darkened as he took it from his hands, unfolding it carefully. His fingers traced the faded ink, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a slow breath. "Your father never wanted you to see this," he murmured. "Not unless it was absolutely necessary." The teenager's throat tightened.
Why?
What was he hiding? The old man set the letter on the counter. Not what? Who? A chill ran down the teenager's spine. The woman crossed her arms. "It's time we tell him the truth." The old man hesitated, then finally nodded. "Your father wasn't just hiding information, he was hiding someone. And that someone is still alive." The teenager's heart nearly stopped. "Who?" The old man's expression was grave. "Your father." The air left the teenager's lungs in a sharp gasp.
No.
"That's not possible." But the woman stepped closer. "It is," she said. "He faked his death to protect you. To protect your mother. And now, after all these years, the people who were after him think you might lead them to him." His mind spun, struggling to process what he was hearing. His whole life, he had lived with the story of his father's tragic death. He had mourned a man he never met. And now they were telling him that it was all a lie. "But why?" he whispered. "Why would he leave us?" The old man's expression softened. "Because he knew if he stayed, you'd never be safe. The people hunting him, hunting you, would have never stopped." The teenager clenched his fists. "And now they think I know where he is?" The woman nodded. "And if they catch you, they'll use you to bring him out." A sharp knock at the door made all three of them jump. The woman moved quickly, peeking through a crack in the curtain. When she turned back, her face was pale. "They found us," she whispered. The old man grabbed the letter, shoving it back into the teenager's hands. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "You need to run. Get out the back, and don't stop until you find him." The teenager's chest tightened. "Find who?" The old man squeezed his shoulder. "Your father." The teenager barely had time to react before the front door burst open. The men in suits flooded in, their eyes locked onto him. "There's no time," the woman hissed. "Go." The teenager turned and sprinted toward the back door, his heart hammering. He shoved it open and ran into the night, the cold air slicing against his skin. Footsteps pounded behind him, but as he ran, one thought burned in his mind. His father was alive, and he was going to find him.